The phone call that torpedoed my brand-new, stress-free life began not with a bang, but with the frantic squawking of a man named Dave. "Man, you Leo Maxwell? From 124 Cypress Lane?" he asked, his voice a cocktail of panic and disbelief, strained over the sound of a rumbling diesel engine. I leaned back in my chair, taking a slow, deliberate sip of coffee. The good stuff. Single-origin Ethiopian beans I'd ground myself. It was my first official act as a free man. A man unshackled from the soul-grinding, beige-tinted purgatory that was the city public works department. 4 days. I'd had 4 whole days of blissful, bureaucratic silence. "I'm Leo," I said, "and my stress level is currently at a picturesque sea level. Please don't throw rocks at it." Outside my basement office window, the sky was the color of a 3-day-old bruise. The wind was starting to make the ancient oak in my backyard do a nervous little dance. Every 10 minutes, my phone and television would erupt in a fresh chorus of apocalyptic warnings about the atmospheric river event barreling toward us. A once-in-a-generation storm, they called it. I called it a perfect excuse to test out my new noise-canceling headphones and finally finish building the 200-scale model of the Golden Gate Bridge that was currently mocking me from my workbench. "Yeah, listen," Dave stammered. "We're out here with the 20 pallets of sandbags you guys ordered, and this woman in a visor won't let us unload. She's talking about unapproved temporary earthen fortifications and threatening to fine my crew for trespassing." I paused, my coffee cup hovering halfway to my mouth. I slowly swiveled my chair to face the small, half-moon window that offered a worm's eye view of the street. And there it was, the idling flatbed truck, loaded to the gills with beautiful, lumpy, flood-stopping sandbags. And standing in front of it, arms crossed like a 5-star general defending a holy site, was a woman in a pastel pink tracksuit and a tennis visor so large it could have its own postal code. Brenda Donaldson, President, Chairwoman, and Supreme Interloper of the Cypress Creek Estates Homeowners Association. My stress level, once so placid and beach-like, was now experiencing a catastrophic tsunami. "She's citing the CC and Rs," Dave continued, his voice cracking. "Section 9, subsection B, paragraph 4. No alteration to lawn-facing topography, temporary or permanent, without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee." I closed my eyes. Of course she was. The storm of the century, a meteorological event with its own ominous name, Hurricane Bartholomew, for crying out loud, was less than 2 hours away from turning our pleasant suburban cul-de-sac into a tributary of the Mississippi. And Brenda was defending the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity from the very thing meant to save our collective property values. "Don't move, Dave," I said, my voice dangerously calm. The calm of a man who'd spent a decade listening to city council members argue that fluid dynamics were a matter of opinion. "Do not engage. Do not make eye contact with the visor. I'll be right there." I hung up the phone and stared at my half-finished bridge. So delicate, so elegant. A monument to the principles of load distribution and tensile strength. Outside, Brenda was a monument to the principle that a little bit of power in the hands of a deeply bored person is more dangerous than a truck full of dynamite. For a beautiful, fleeting second, I considered just letting it happen. Let the flood come. Let it wash away Brenda's prize-winning petunias and her perfectly edged lawn. It would be a lesson, written by Mother Nature in muddy Category 2 hurricane-sized font. Then I looked around my basement, my sanctuary, my custom-built bookshelves, my vintage arcade cabinet, my brand-new ridiculously plush sectional sofa, the carpet I'd spent a week picking out, my model bridge. Nope, not an option. Brenda had chosen war. She just didn't realize I had a weapon she couldn't possibly comprehend. A deep, intimate, and profoundly bitter understanding of the bureaucracy she held so dear. My journey to the garage was a grim march. I bypassed the gleaming racks of power tools and my beautifully organized workbench. My destination was in the far corner, covered in a dusty tarp. An old, olive-drab footlocker that smelled faintly of motor oil, stale coffee, and 40 years of municipal service. My dad's footlocker. My dad was a legend at public works, a civil engineer from the old school. He was a man who could calculate the flow rate of a collapsed sewer main on the back of a napkin and quell a union dispute with a single, well-timed grunt. He retired a few years back, leaving behind a legacy of over-engineered bridges and impeccably graded roads. He also left me this footlocker, his apocalypse kit, he'd called it. I heaved the lid open. Inside, nestled amongst worn blueprints and heavy-duty thermoses, was a worn leather wallet. I flipped it open. There they were. 2 laminated City Public Works Department ID badges. One had my dad's photo on it, a much younger man with a confident smirk, name proudly displayed, Frank Maxwell, senior engineer. The other was a spare, a blank slate of opportunity. No photo, no name, just the official city seal and the intimidating words, Department of Public Works, official personnel. An idea, a terrible, beautiful, magnificently petty idea, began to blossom in my mind. Brenda couldn't be reasoned with. You can't reason with a religious zealot, and Brenda's religion was the CC and ours. She couldn't be intimidated by a civilian. In her world, homeowners were peasants to be governed. But she worshipped at the altar of officialdom. She genuflected before the gods of permits and ordinances. A guy in a t-shirt was a problem. A guy in a high-visibility vest holding a clipboard? That wasn't a person. That was an authority figure. And an authority figure could ruin her day with a citation. It was her only weakness. Deeper in the footlocker, I found it. A fluorescent yellow safety vest, slightly faded, with City PW stenciled on the back. A white hard hat. I grabbed the blank ID badge and slipped it into the clear plastic holder on the vest's pocket. I snatched a clipboard from my own workbench, slapped a blank sheet of graph paper on it, and clicked a pen. I put on the gear and took a look at my reflection in the dusty side window of my SUV. The man staring back wasn't Leo Maxwell, newly liberated freelance consultant. It was a man who looked tired. A man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. A man who was 2 seconds away from shutting down your entire operation because your rebar wasn't spaced to code. I was perfect. I smiled. It was showtime. The scene at the entrance to the cul-de-sac was even more pathetic up close. The wind was whipping now, carrying a cold, spitting rain with it. Dave and his crew of 2 were huddled by their truck, looking like they were waiting for a firing squad. And Brenda was pacing back and forth, visor pulled down low, a sentinel guarding the gates of suburbia from the scourge of common sense. I didn't walk, I strode. I adopted the gait I'd seen my dad use 100 times, purposeful, slightly annoyed, the walk of a man on a schedule with no time for nonsense. I ignored Brenda completely. My focus was entirely on Dave. I marched right up to him, clipboard held at a stern 45-degree angle. "Sir," I began, my voice a full octave lower than usual, laced with the gravel of manufactured authority. "I'm Inspector Maxwell with the City Public Works Emergency Flood Mitigation Task Force. We've been monitoring the atmospheric river event and have designated this entire sector a Priority 1 flash flood risk zone. Can you explain to me why this critical deployment of preventative material is being delayed?" I threw in every piece of jargon I could think of. Atmospheric river. Priority 1. Preventative material. It was a beautiful symphony of bullshit. Dave, bless his heart, played along instantly. His eyes widened slightly, and he straightened up. "Inspector, we were just about to unload when this resident," he said, gesturing with his thumb toward Brenda, "informed us we were in violation of a local ordinance." Only then did I turn to Brenda. I let my eyes travel from her pristine white sneakers up to her pastel tracksuit, and finally to the enormous visor. I fixed her with a look of profound, weary disappointment, as if she were a particularly dense pothole. She was momentarily flustered, her script interrupted. "I am the president of this homeowners association," she announced, recovering. "You can't just come in here and who authorized this?" I sighed. A long, theatrical exhalation of pure bureaucratic suffering. "Ma'am, the authorization comes from Municipal Code 113.8, subsection C, pertaining to the preemptive safeguarding of city-maintained drainage infrastructure during a federally declared state of emergency." I tapped my blank, yet incredibly official-looking Idaho badge. "My authorization is right here. Now, for my report, are you the property owner of record currently interfering with this emergency deployment?" I clicked my pen. I made a deliberate, scratchy note on my clipboard. This was the kill shot. The clipboard. In the wild, the dominant predator asserts its authority through size or ferocity. In the wilds of suburbia, it's the person holding the clipboard. And I had just stolen her power. "Interfering?" she stammered, her confidence wavering for the first time. "I am not interfering. I am simply ensuring that all temporary installations adhere to the community aesthetic guidelines and—" I cut her off, holding up a hand. "Ma'am, with all due respect, your aesthetic guidelines are now a subordinate clause to a multi-agency emergency protocol. Your CC&Rs do not supersede municipal, state, and federal emergency declarations. If you continue to obstruct my crew—" I gestured to Dave's guys, who were now looking at me like I was Moses parting the Red Sea. "I will be forced to cite you for impedance of a municipal operation. Fines start at $5,000 per hour of delay. And my watch says we've been delayed for—" I checked my wrist dramatically. 32 minutes. The clock is ticking. "Now, gentlemen," I said, turning back to the crew, "let's start with the properties at the low end of the cul-de-sac. That's where the primary ingress will be." Brenda stood there, mouth agape, her brain blue-screening as it tried to process the onslaught of superior jargon. She was a fish, flopped onto the deck, completely out of her water. She sputtered, she glared, but she stepped aside. The crew practically leaped into action, a palpable wave of relief washing over them. Dave caught my eye as he passed and gave me a subtle, grateful nod. I just tipped my hard hat. Phase 1 was complete. Of course, I knew it wouldn't be that easy. People like Brenda don't just accept defeat. They escalate. And her escalation arrived about 15 minutes later in the form of a black and white police cruiser. It rolled up silently, lights off, slicing through the increasingly heavy rain. 2 officers climbed out, their faces set in the permanent state of weary resignation that cops wear like a uniform. The older one, Miller, had a mustache that had seen things. The younger one, Sanchez, still had a bit of hopeful energy in his step. It wouldn't last. Brenda, revitalized by the sight of a different flavor of authority, practically sprinted toward them. "Officers! Thank goodness! This man is impersonating a city official," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He's forcing this crew to deface our community common areas with these hideous bags." I watched them listen to her tirade, Miller's face an unreadable mask, Sanchez nodding politely. I let her finish, letting her dig her own hole a little deeper. Then I walked over, my stride still calm and purposeful, My hard hat dripping rain onto the brim, I addressed Miller, the alpha of the pair. "Evening, officer," I said, giving him a professional nod. "Inspector Maxwell, Public Works. Just trying to get this sector prepped before the main cell hits. Appreciate you guys keeping the peace. This resident seems a little confused about the emergency protocols." Miller's eyes flicked from me to Brenda, then to the sandbags being expertly stacked around my neighbor Stan's prize-winning azaleas, then up to the ominous black sky. He was a 20-year veteran. He'd seen 1,000 domestic squabbles, 100 neighborhood feuds. He could smell a righteous crusade from a mile away, and he knew Brenda wasn't on the side of the angels. "Uh-huh. Confused," he said, his voice as dry as sandpaper. He turned to Brenda. "Ma'am, is he actively damaging any property?" "He's damaging the ambience," she shrieked. "The curb appeal. We're going to be the laughingstock of the Tri-County area." Miller took a deep breath. I could almost see the retirement countdown clicking away behind his eyes. He turned back to me, and for a split second, I saw a glint of amusement, a flicker of solidarity. "Looks like you've got it under control, Inspector," he said, putting just the slightest emphasis on the title. "Just try to keep the mud off the public sidewalk if you can." He gave me a wink, so subtle it was barely there. Then he turned to Brenda, his voice all business. "Ma'am, with all due respect, we have about 50 other storm-related calls to get to. There's a tree down on Elm Street. I suggest you go inside, have a cup of tea, and let these people do their jobs. Have a nice evening." And with that, they were gone. They got in their car and drove away, leaving Brenda standing alone in the downpour, steam practically rising from her visor. She had played her trump card, and it had been casually tossed into the discard pile. The other neighbors, who'd been watching the drama unfold from their windows, started to emerge, one by one, offering the Sandbag crew coffee and help. The balance of power in the cul-de-sac had shifted. The Sandbags were a good start, a solid defensive line. But I knew they were just a band-aid. I'd studied the civil engineering plans for this subdivision when I first moved in. It's a sickness, I know. I can't help it. The real problem, the reason our street was a designated flood risk, was a 24-inch corrugated steel culvert at the end of the street. It was supposed to drain the entire cul-de-sac into the main storm sewer under the adjacent avenue. But years of neglect I knew from reading the HOA meeting minutes that Brenda had championed to save money for new, seasonal entrance banners, had allowed it to fill with silt and debris. Now it was probably half collapsed. The sandbags would hold back the water, but with nowhere for it to go, it would just keep rising. I needed bigger guns. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I knew by heart. It rang twice. A gravelly voice answered with a single word. "Yeah? Gus, it's Leo, Maxwell's kid." There was a pause. "Frank's kid, thought you were a desk jockey now." "Not anymore," I said. "Listen, I've got a side project for you. Emergency rates, cash. I need you and your mini excavator here 30 minutes ago. The job? Unscrewing years of bureaucratic neglect at the end of my street. Oh, and there's a pissed-off HOA president who thinks a backhoe might clash with the color of her petunias. You'll love her." A low chuckle rumbled through the phone. 30 minutes, Gus said, and hung up. Gus was a force of nature. A semi-retired contractor who had forgotten more about earth moving than most engineers ever learn. He'd worked with my dad for 30 years. He communicated in grunts and swore with a fluency that bordered on poetic. He arrived in 25 minutes, his F-350 hauling a trailer with a battered but powerful-looking yellow mini excavator. He got out, a stout man with a weathered face and hands like catcher's mitts. He surveyed the scene, the frantic sandbagging, the rising water in the gutters, the general air of controlled chaos. He walked to the end of the street, stared at the drainage ditch for about 10 seconds, and spat. "Yep, she's clogged," he announced to no one in particular. "Idiots let the sediment build up. Should have been jetted 5 years ago. Now the pipe's probably crushed under the pressure. Who's the genius in charge here?" I pointed to Brenda's house, where she was now documenting our every move with her phone from her living room window. Gus just shook his head. "Figures." He and his one-man crew, a quiet young guy named Carlos, unloaded the excavator with practiced efficiency. The roar of its small diesel engine was a beautiful sound, the sound of an actual solution. Gus became my ground commander, the physical force to my strategic direction. He didn't need blueprints. He could read the land. Under my guidance, he began to dig a shallow, temporary bypass channel, a controlled trench designed to intercept the water before it could pool in the cul-de-sac and divert it directly into the larger storm drain access point down the street. It was a messy, brutal, and absolutely necessary piece of emergency engineering. From her window, Brenda's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Every scoop of mud Gus's bucket lifted from the community greenbelt was a fresh wound to her soul. I didn't care. The real storm was just beginning to hit. And then the heavens opened. The spitting rain became a deafening, vertical wall of water. The wind went from a howl to a shriek, tearing at the trees. Our little cul-de-sac, lit by Gus's floodlights and the occasional flash of lightning, became a battlefield. The enemy was gravity, and its army was 1,000,000 gallons of water. This was it, the test. The moment where theory, bluffing, and brute force either paid off or failed spectacularly. I was in my element, soaked to the bone, mud caking my boots, shouting instructions to Gus over the roar of the storm. For the first time since I'd quit my job, I felt truly alive. This wasn't about paperwork or budgets. This was about physics, pure, simple, and very, very wet. My neighbors, who had once been meek subjects of Brenda's suburban fiefdom, were now a unified, determined crew. Old Mr. Henderson, who usually only came out to meticulously polish his classic car, was hauling sandbags next to a 20-something tech bro I'd never spoken to before. Stan, the retired accountant from across the street, had taken on the role of quartermaster, running back and forth with a giant thermos of coffee that he somehow kept refilling. We were the Cypress Creek Volunteer Army, and Brenda's tyranny had inadvertently become our rallying cry. The water rose fast. It swamped the gutters, then the curbs, turning the asphalt into a dark, churning river. I stood near the sandbag wall protecting my driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. This was the moment of truth. The water lapped at the first layer of burlap bags, then the second. It pushed, it probed, searching for a weakness. And it held. A ragged cheer went up from our little crew. The wall was holding. All along the low side of the street, the hastily constructed levees were doing their job. The bypass channel Gus had dug was a raging torrent now, a muddy but effective river diverting the bulk of the flow away from our homes and down toward the main road. We had done it. My eyes, however, were drawn across the street, to Brenda's house, number 135, the model home. The yard that won Yard of the Month 11 out of 12 times a year. It was pristine, perfectly manicured, and completely, utterly defenseless. There were no ugly, tacky sandbags protecting her property. And because of the street's slight, almost imperceptible gradient, the bypass channel we'd dug was effectively steering the floodwater away from our houses and creating a perfect, unimpeded path directly toward hers. I watched, mesmerized, as a brown tide crept across her award-winning lawn. It swirled around the base of her flamingo-pink plastic flamingos, a clear violation of the very CC&Rs she enforced, I noted internally, and consumed her prize-winning petunias. It was a beautiful, karmic, hydrostatic demonstration. Brenda had prioritized aesthetics over function, and now the ugly, messy reality of the situation was washing up on her doorstep. Literally. A light flicked on in her living room. I could see her silhouette in the window, her hands flying to her face in a gesture of pure horror. The water reached her pristine porch, hesitated for a moment, and then began to seep, dark and inexorable, under her front door. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The caller ID glowed with her name, Brenda from HR. I almost didn't answer, but I had to. The final act of the play required a monologue. I answered and put it on speaker. "Hello?" I said, my voice calm. "My house is flooding!" she screamed, her voice a hysterical shriek over the roar of the storm. "The water! It's everywhere! You have to do something! Your ditch! It's pointing right at me!" I took a slow, satisfying sip of Stan's lukewarm coffee. I looked at my dry driveway. I looked at my neighbors, huddled together but safe. Then I looked back at her dark, drowning house. "Ma'am, I understand you're experiencing some water intrusion," I said, adopting my most placid, infuriatingly official tone. "That is unfortunate. As per the emergency protocols, any requests for assistance must be submitted on the correct forms. You'll need to file a Form 7B/9. That's the request for post-incident mitigation. You can submit that directly to the HOA Aesthetics Committee for initial approval. Once it's been signed, dated, and notarized, I'll be happy to review it. Given the current backlog, we'll likely get back to you in 6 to 8 business weeks." There was a moment of sputtering, incoherent rage on the other end of the line. "Stay safe out there," I said cheerfully, and hung up. Stan, who had been standing nearby, let out a choked laugh that he tried to disguise as a cough. The tech bro gave me a fist bump. We had faced the flood, and we had won. The dawn came, as it always does, with a sense of quiet disbelief. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world that was washed clean and rearranged. The sky was a pale, watercolor blue. Steam rose from the asphalt. The air smelled of wet earth and ozone, and the sound of birdsong was conspicuously absent, replaced by the distant hum of generators and the squelch of boots in mud. My house was fine. My basement was bone dry. My model bridge sat on its workbench, an undisturbed monument to order and precision. My neighbors were in similar shape. Their lawns were a mess, littered with leaves and debris, but their foundations were sound. Brenda's house, however, was a different story. It looked like a beached whale. A muddy waterline formed a dirty bathtub ring a foot high around the entire first floor. Through the windows, I could see overturned furniture. A large white Serv-Pipro truck was already parked in her driveway, its crew moving with the grim efficiency of battlefield medics. Brenda herself was on the lawn, her pink tracksuit now stained with mud, her visor askew, arguing with an insurance adjuster who already looked like he was regretting every decision that had led him to this moment. As I stepped out onto my porch with my morning coffee, a hero's welcome assembled. Stan clapped me on the back, hard enough to make me spill a little. "You saved us, Leo. You really did." "I'm not a hero, Stan," I said, taking a sip. "I'm just a guy who really, really didn't want to have to replace his new basement carpet. The noblest motivations are always the most practical." Gus pulled up in his truck, the mini excavator already loaded and strapped down. He climbed out and handed me a piece of paper torn from a spiral notebook. It was an invoice, written in greasy pencil, for a sum that made my eyes water. Before the panic could fully set in, Stan and 2 other neighbors, the tech bro and Mr. Henderson, stepped forward. "We took up a collection," Stan said, handing me a thick envelope stuffed with cash. It felt heavy. "This should cover it, and probably a little extra for your troubles. The first round at the pub is on us for the rest of the year." I was speechless. I just nodded. a lump forming in my throat. I paid Gus, who counted the cash, grunted his approval, and said, "Your dad taught you well, kid," before climbing back into his truck and rumbling away. A week later, the emergency HOA meeting was held on the miraculously recovering community greenbelt. The air was thick with the smell of freshly cut grass and revolution. The agenda was supposed to be about coordinating cleanup and filing a master insurance claim. But everyone knew what this was really about. It was a regime change. Stan, now the de facto leader of the cul-de-sac, stood before the assembled homeowners and calmly laid out the facts. He had printed out statements from Dave and the Sandbag crew. Gus had even agreed to show up and was leaning against his truck with his arms crossed, a silent, intimidating witness for the prosecution. He spoke for 2 minutes about the criminal neglect of the culvert, ending with, "Any fool could see this was going to happen. You gotta maintain your infrastructure." Brenda tried to mount a defense. She brought her binder, the holy text of CC and Rs, and began to babble about protocols and unauthorized soil displacement and the sanctity of the Architectural Review Committee. But no one was listening. Her power, which had always been derived from the illusion of control and the tacit consent of the governed, had been washed away in the flood. All they saw was the woman whose obsession with appearances had nearly cost them everything and had ultimately ruined her own home. A motion was made from the crowd for a vote of no confidence in Brenda Donaldson as HOA president. It passed 34-1. Stan was nominated to take her place, and he was elected by a roar of acclamation. His first act as president was to propose a new emergency bylaw, which he'd written out on an index card. He called it the Common Sense Clause. It stated simply that in the event of a natural disaster or other declared emergency, all aesthetic-related bylaws were immediately and indefinitely suspended. It passed unanimously. Life in Cypress Creek Estates improved dramatically over the next month. The oppressive cloud of petty tyranny had lifted. People left their garbage cans out for an extra hour without fear of a passive-aggressive newsletter mention. The culvert was being professionally repaired and upgraded, paid for by a special assessment that everyone, for the first time in the HOA's history, gladly approved. I became a reluctant local legend. I tried to maintain my cynical, quiet lifestyle, but it was a losing battle. I kept finding baskets of muffins and bottles of decent whiskey on my front porch. Better yet, my freelance career took off. I landed 3 lucrative consulting jobs from neighbors who, as Mr. Henderson put it, were impressed by my proactive project management style. One afternoon, I saw a moving truck parked in front of Brenda's house. Her home, now fully remediated but still carrying the stigma of the flood, had sold at a significant loss. As she directed the movers, she caught my eye from across the street. She gave me a final, withering glare of pure, unadulterated hatred. I just raised my coffee mug in a silent, cheerful toast. Just as her moving truck pulled away for the last time, another, more official-looking vehicle pulled up in front of my house. A pristine white pickup with the City of Public Works seal on the door. My heart did a little tap dance against my ribs. This is it, I thought. The jig is up. I'm about to be arrested for impersonating an inspector and commandeering a Sandbag crew. A man in a crisp city uniform got out. He wasn't a cop. He looked like a departmental courier. He walked up my driveway and handed me a small, heavy box. "From the director's office," he said with a nod, and then left. I took the box inside, my hands trembling slightly. I set it on my kitchen counter and carefully opened it. Inside, nestled in a bed of crinkled paper, was a bottle of 21-year-old single malt scotch, an absurdly expensive bottle. Tucked beside it was a business card. William Sanderson, Director, City Department of Public Works. Bill was my dad's old boss, a man I'd met a handful of times at retirement parties. I flipped the card over. There, scrawled in a familiar, authoritative handwriting, was a short note. Leo, heard you were helping out with some emergency mitigation on Cypress Lane. Your dad would be proud. Nice work, Inspector. Bill. I stood there, in my quiet kitchen, the bottle of scotch in my hand, and I started to laugh. A genuine, unrestrained, deep belly laugh. They knew. The whole time, someone in the old office had probably been following the chatter, heard about some mysterious Inspector Maxwell appearing out of nowhere, put two and two together, and decided to let it ride. I looked out the window at my peaceful street, at the happy, non-flooded houses of my neighbors. Maybe, I thought, as I broke the seal on the bottle, a little bureaucracy wasn't so bad after all, as long as you were the one making it up.